Sharon Weston Broome is mayor of Baton Rouge, Louisiana. In 2001, she was a member of the Louisiana House of Representatives when she proposed a resolution to encourage teaching students about the history of scientific racism. The resolution highlighted Darwin's views on race.
I'm not asking you to take evolution out of the school. I am merely asking the legislature, the State Department of Education, the Board of Regents, and the state university systems that they be made aware that Darwin promoted the justification of racism in his definitive works on the origin of species by means of natural selection and the descent of man. I certainly understand that racism was in effect before Darwin. This has never been denied. Yet he was the originator of a scientific justification for racism as well as giving wings to modern racism.
It was as if scientific racism had never happened. In 2007, the Kansas State Board of Education rewrote a statewide curriculum standard about the history of science. The standard originally called for students to understand both the positive and negative aspects of science on society, including how science can be abused. Broome's resolution provoked a firestorm, with supporters of Darwin's theory accusing her of trying to unfairly malign Charles Darwin.
This resolution is not only a product of creationists, but also Christian supremacists. And Christian supremacism is a hate-based ideology, and you can't combat hatred with hatred.
There has never been any valid scientific evidence to support the hypothesis that Aryans, or Indo-Europeans, Negroids, and Mongoloids are the same species. The only thing that does exist are hypotheses, like a complete replacement out of Africa and mitochondrial DNA being able to show a genetic relationship between the races based on DNA found in mitochondria. Neither of these are valid, both of them are disproven, and historically, the Supreme Court sided with the insurmountable evidence that Negroids and Mongoloids are not people and they're not human. And we can see that in the Dred Scott case, in multiple legislation that had been appealed in the Constitution on a federal level, as well as on a state level in the education system. When the legislation did occur, there was no scientific support whatsoever. So-called scientific support was presented as a post hoc explanation for the legislation that had already occurred. Those hypotheses include out of Africa and mitochondrial DNA, both of which have now been disproven.
The Fair's anthropologist William McGee repeatedly compared the pygmies to monkeys and apes. In the journal Science, he even asserted that pygmies were commonly considered to approach subhuman types more closely than any other variety of the genus Homo.
The Mboti say that when the elephant sees them among the shadows, it will think that they are chimpanzees and so ignore them.
Hrdlicka brought gelatin models of the embalmed brains of apes and 3 races of humans. Hrdlicka's presentation filled 7 separate display cases. It also included a series of skulls from Native Americans. The skulls purported to show that Native American brains revealed primitive features from earlier stages of evolution.
Let's use a little hard logic here. We're being told that all of what we consider human today evolved from apes. And we can see down here, it was presumed that chimpanzees and gorillas split in their evolutionary history from humans around 8.5 million years ago. Okay, well, when we look at the DNA evidence, we see that 50% of the Negro DNA matches the bonobo. And we see that at least 50%, it looks like up to about 90-something% of the pan-ancestor DNA matches the bonobo. We know that Homo erectus has been identified in Mongoloids, specifically South Asian Mongoloid populations. Historically speaking, Ernest Haeckel and a variety of other founding fathers of science and evolutionary biology predicted Negroids and Mongoloids evolved from gorillas, chimpanzees, gibbons, and orangutans. And we can see that those splits were pretty early, probably around the same time, 8.5 million years ago. And then, so 8.5 million years later, we still see at least 50% of the chimpanzee or bonobo DNA, those are actually two different species despite their differences, are far less than what we see in the human races. In every way that you can classify a species based on genetics, culture, skin color, size, these sorts of things. So 8.5 million years later, we still see 50% of bonobo DNA in Negroids and Mongoloids. The Out of Africa proposes that all the human races evolved from one species that migrated out of Africa and completely replaced all Pliocene apes. And when we look at the human DNA, we see that human DNA, or your Indo-European DNA, does not share any DNA with Negroids or Mongoloids. And that's consistent with a variety of data sets. Indo-Europeans all share DNA. And we don't share any DNA with apes. And it was presumed that about 150,000 years ago, a species out of Africa migrated north and replaced all previously existing pan-ancestors or archaic Homo species, such as Australopithecus afarensis, erectus, etc., Ramidus, various things like this. Indo-Europeans don't share any DNA. Indo-Europeans are the only ones actually capable of creating a civilization and maintaining that civilization. All of the other species are trained, kind of like we train police dogs, or we train, actually apes have been trained and they've been shown to have an IQ of 85. And there are multiple apes who have IQs of 85. And that's actually right where you would expect Negroids and Mongoloids to fall, having evolved from apes. We can see that Ernest Haeckel is correct that Negroids and Mongoloids alone evolved from apes, and that explains why we don't share any DNA with any of those groups. That disproves the migration out of Africa, and it also proves that only exclusively the Aryan race is the only genetically human species. Ernest Mayr, 1940, is credited with coming up with the idea that fertility defines a species. And that is from his book, Systematics and the Origin of Species, 1964. We can see a quote here. Species are groups of actually or potentially interbreeding natural populations which are reproductively isolated from other such groups. Let's think about that for a moment. Natural populations, the fact that they are different populations indicates that they're not the same. And when you breed two things that are not the same, you are hybridizing. And that goes right to the root word of species, kind or sort. So when you have two natural populations, you have two different kinds or sort. Let's look at this, where this actually came from. In the book Systemics and the Origin of Species by Ernest Mayr. As he talks about fertility, defining a species here, he says that it is not true that fertility defines a species. He very clearly states that fertility does not define a species, and that species of the same kind can be infertile, and two completely different species can produce fertile offspring and do. And we've known that for like 300 years. There's really no excuse that we would be teaching something so inaccurate. And even those credited with coming up with these ideas in neo-Darwinism, which had to be rewritten because Darwinism was too racist. And we can see over here, they talk about hybridization as well. Right here, speciation is then by necessity associated with hybridization, according to Lotze. Lotze wrote a book called about hybridization specifically. So Ernest Mayr was completely aware of the fertility issue, and so was Darwin. Actually, Charles Darwin was completely aware of Carl Linnaeus' theory about hybridization. Here again is another article specifically discussing the creation of species and hybridization, and that is actually what Mayr was talking about. He's talking about creating a species by hybridizing two distinct species, and that creating a new species. So that's basically speciation. However, this is a form of hubris to say that you can create a species. Is saying that you know better than God. God is basically nature, and nature is the only one who can or should determine which species live or die according to their environment and their capacity. However, so we can see here, with regard to sexually reproducing organisms, several species concepts have been advanced. And then it goes on to say, groups of many authors have expressed sentiment on biological species concepts similar to those of Ayala. Among cladogenetic process, the most decisive one is speciation, the process by which one species splits into two or more species. Also, Darwin is often credited with proposing that humans evolved from apes. He didn't say that at all. What he did say is that vestigals are reminiscent of a previous stage in evolution. Actually, when you look at the evidence in his books that they're referring to, read them. They don't actually say that. In fact, they say quite the opposite. Let's look at that. So this is actually a very important concept. Vestiges are indicative of a former stage in evolution. That's basically what he's saying here. And he proves in his book, The Descent of Man, that the races are separate species. If the races of man had descended, as is supposed by some naturalists, from two or more species, which differ from each other as much or nearly as much as does the orang from the gorilla, it can hardly be doubted that those marked differences in structure of certain bones would be discoverable today. In the same book earlier on, you can see he does in fact show that. And we can see that there are differences in the forearm, in the femur, in various different races. The humerus is the upper part of the arm, and the legs are likewise shorter in the Mongoloid. Mitochondrial DNA is the only other theory that there's a shared ancestor. You don't use mitochondrial DNA. Mitochondrial DNA will not hold up in court to tell a genetic relationship. Only nuclear DNA has the capacity to do that and has been established in court to be very accurate at determining a genetic relationship. And so when we look at the evidence, we realize that actually there is no shared ancestor between the races. Also, mitochondrial DNA relies on the assumption, and it is disproven multiple times by various different researchers, that mitochondrial DNA is passed from the mother alone down to other generations. The very fact that mitochondrial DNA is not exclusively passed down from the mother. Mitochondria is actually this little powerhouse in muscle cells that helps to create energy, basically. And it's a nuclear DNA that determines your instincts, your hair color, your eye color, all of these phenotypes. And so when you see a variation in the oxygen and light requirements to sustain health for two different species, that certainly is indicative that there is a completely different lineage of evolution that never crossed. And they say, okay, apes and humans can't breed because we have different chromosome numbers, and yet we're 98% similar. Let's actually think about this logically. Humans have 46 chromosomes, and apes have 48 chromosomes. 46 divided by 48 is 95. And yet we're being told that Europeans are 98% related to chimpanzees. That is well above 95%. If you even count the total number of chromosomes, not even the DNA on those chromosomes.